Hello everyone and welcome to the show. It's been a while and it's good to be back. As I may have mentioned last episode, there's been quite a lot going on here, including a house move and some major renovations, so I've been swamped with building chores for many moons now. As such, it's my great pleasure to delve back into the podcast with today's show. Dr. Eleanor Dobson is lecturer in 19th century literature at the University of Birmingham, with a particular focus on the reception of ancient Egypt in this period and into the 20th century. She was instrumental in the foundation of the Tea with the Sphinx annual conference and author of several fascinating papers which I encourage you to find online, as well as the upcoming book Ancient Egypt in the Modern Imagination, Art, Literature and Culture. We sat down over Skype to talk about the inspirations behind some major horror and mummy fiction, as well as some unexpected social connections between some famous and infamous Egyptologists and occultists of the 19th century. So if you like your Budge with a slice of Crowley, or your Yeats with a slice of Lovecraft, you've come to the right place. As ever, if you enjoy the show, please give it a like and a share and help the audience grow, and be sure to check out the work of our guests. Without further ado, Dr. Ellie Dobson. Dr. Dobson, Ellie, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I first heard your name in connection to the Tea with the Sphinx conferences. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how you became involved in that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it all started because my PhD supervisor, I was a PhD student at the time, put me in touch with one of his MA students, and his name is David Gage. He's a historian. He's written a very influential book in my neck of the woods, academically, called Dialogues with the Dead. So he basically wrote a new history of Egyptology and science and religion from 1822 to 1922. And me and David's other student kicked things off and decided to see who else was working in similar areas, ancient Egypt reception. And it's kind of blossomed after that, after the first one. And
how many of those have you done now?
So I was involved in the first two, and then after that, it was actually the second one. I think it happened the week before I started my lectureship here. And after that point, I said, okay, it's grown from postgrads, and it should still be a postgrad thing, because it's postgrads who are, they have the time and the space, and they do often the most cutting edge work on this stuff, I think. So it was important to me, I think, to let it go and let others take up the mantle, really.
You've let others carry the torch for you, so to speak, on that front now.
Yes, there's been a third one. There's been a very successful third one in 2018. It's
something I always intended to put a paper in for, and unfortunately always miss the deadline because I don't keep up on academic conferences, and that was one of the few that I actually really wanted to get involved in. But there's always another year, I'm pleased to hear. So that's
good. That's true.
So one of the questions I tend to ask Egyptologists who come onto the show, and I think this does apply to you, because originally I thought you were an Egyptologist.
Okay.
Probably my misassumption because of the conference work.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a lot of, really interesting work going on in Egyptology with respect to Egyptian reception now. But I thought once I'd learned that you were coming from a literature, and particularly a Gothic literature kind of perspective, I thought that was really fascinating, because of course that brings in perspectives that we as Egyptologists don't necessarily have the context for with regards to the literature and the scene that those writings are being created within, the context of those Victorian writings particularly. But one of the questions I always ask Egyptologists who come onto the show is, why Egypt? And was there some kind of formative experience that attracted you to that? And I think this is probably even more relevant given that you're not in Egyptology itself. So why the attraction to Egypt when you have this, entire canvas in front of you of different things?
This is a very interesting question, and I think the answer will be similar to lots of what your proper Egyptologists will say.
Oh no, I'm not implying you're not a proper Egyptologist.
It's very flattering to be mistaken for an Egyptologist. I think it's a childhood thing for most people, isn't it? So you go to the museum, you see the objects. Sometimes you're even seeing human remains, and you're just kind of startled in a way that you can never really shake. There were also books that were very important to me. There was a very glitzy one with lots of little fold-out maps and letters and things. I think it was called Egyptology, although it didn't have much to do with real Egyptology.
I know the book you mean. I have a copy of that.
Do you? Yeah. See, I had that as a kid, and I saw it recently in the shops, and I thought, I remember this. This was incredible. And then you get a bit older and you watch the 1999 The Mummy, and you think, yeah, this is awesome. And the amount of Egyptologists I've met who watch that film, that's the thing that gets them through the door. So I've always had an interest in Egypt. I went to university and did literature, and there was a time where I thought, am I going to go and do Egyptology instead? And it was literature that won at the end of the day. But I'm still rubbing shoulders with Egyptologists.
Yes, of course, absolutely. And I mean, like I say, you kind of come at it from a slightly different perspective, which I think enriches both your field and ours, because we get to see, I was reading some of your papers last night doing my 11th hour research, as is often the case, and it was really fascinating for me. So, for instance, I was reading Sleeping Beauties, the mummies and fairy tale genre. How do you pronounce fin de siècle? Fin de siècle. Okay, see.
Yeah, it's French.
My French is terrible. And my pronunciations in general are just terrible. But I found that a really fascinating piece, because I had never, say, in Egyptological works that deal with, consuming ancient Egypt and Egyptomania and things like that, I'd never seen a comparison with Sleeping Beauties and fairy tale literature and the countenance of the sleeping female mummy. And I thought that was a really insightful, kind of unique perspective and way to look at that. Actually, can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, of course we can.
So, I mean, my understanding of the paper is this is kind of the way that the literature dealing with mummies in the period is kind of both reconciling and providing a stance against the feminine qualities of the fairy tale and the quote-unquote masculine qualities of the adventure tale. I thought there was some really interesting stuff in there about the idea of the glass case for Sleeping Beauty and the glass case for the remains of the mummy, and how this, keeps objectifies and keeps things on display. Could you kind of, I'm not going to relate this very well, but you wrote the paper, so could you just talk us through that a little bit?
Well, I think you summed it up really well. I mean, there is this interesting vein that runs through literature where the female mummy is idealized to the point that she could just wake up. And it's this fantasy that we get in literature quite persistently, often male-authored literature as well. So there's kind of a heterosexual kind of narrative going on there that I suppose, combines the kind of masculinity of the kind of thrusting H. Rider Haggard hero, but combines it with this folkloric thread which seems very kind of feminine. What's quite interesting though is, and I didn't get to this point by the time I wrote that article, but you actually get Egyptologists themselves participating in that kind of narrative.
Oh, do tell.
Oh, there is one. I think possibly the best thing I found in an archive ever is a poem that Amelia Edwards wrote for Flinders Petrie. Mm-hmm. It's not a very good poem.
She wrote a poem for Flinders Petrie?
She wrote a poem for Petrie. And it was from the perspective of a male Egyptologist who unearths a female mummy and falls in love with it and does the kind of Sleeping Beauty fantasy with it.
Wow.
But it's not a good poem. She herself says, "Dear Flinders, I'm really sorry. This isn't very good, but here you go," which I thought was quite sweet.
Do we have any context? Because, of course, she was one of the key figures in founding the Egypt Exploration Society. Yeah. And Flinders Petrie is, of course, called the godfather of modern Egyptology and modern archaeology, scientific archaeology in general. So these are two major figures in the history of our discipline, certainly. Is there any context for why she's written him this poem?
I mean, he's kind of her protege, isn't he? So
right.
I suppose there is a sense that she's kind of helping him, building him up, carving out a kind of career path for him. I don't think it was, I don't want to speculate and say she wrote him this romantic poem because there was something going on.
Sure, of course.
Although what a great story that would be.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see the fan fiction rolling in as we speak. Yeah,
absolutely. But it just seems to be, especially her as somebody who is sometimes called the godmother of Egyptology, isn't she? She's kind of on the periphery of Egyptology in a way that she's made a name for herself as a novelist already.
Yeah.
And then when she travels in Egypt, she gets really into it. And for whatever reasons, including probably religious ones, kickstarts the EES.
Yeah.
And within that space, she is kind of a leading figure, but also not a kind of trained professional Egyptologist. So she bridges an interesting divide, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you should mention the religious motivations of the foundation of the EES, because obviously a lot of early Egyptological discoveries and excavations were inspired by and funded because they were linked to biblical tales. Root of the Exodus and all of these kind of things were things that the early EES were really interested in investigating. Bringing it back to the Sleeping Beauties idea, I noticed there was a tale in there, an Egyptian princess with the court of King Arthur.
Oh yes,
and you talk about the story of this princess coming over and being destroyed by Merlin and sent under the waves, and the Lady of the Lake reprimands Merlin and brings her to the court, and then she's essentially a sleeping beauty who is awoken by the kiss of, it's Sir Galahad, isn't it?
I think it is Galahad, yeah.
And it strikes me as kind of really interesting that this kind of thing is taking on these forms, this mythology which stretches back, I guess, to folklore, is taking on the dressings of two quite, because I've looked at Arthurian myth, and I've looked at obviously a lot of Egyptian mythology and stories of that, and never the twain shall meet. Really, it's very rare that you see anything like that. But what I found really interesting about that particular story is that this Egyptian princess who's travelled across the ocean to I guess meet and marry a knight. I don't really understand what her motivation's supposed to be, but she converts to Christianity so that they can be married. And in one sense, this is seen at the time as the idea of reconciliation and symbiosis between colonial Britain and Egypt. But from my perspective, this seems like a very kind of a violent removal almost of this princess from her own context, from her own culture, and assimilation straight into Western cultural mores and religious ideology and things like that. And it strikes me as a much harder thing than it might have done a reader at the time. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things with those pieces of fiction and that poetry that you see regularly is the ancient Egyptian priestess or princess. She's usually some kind of high-ranking figure. She has dark hair and dark eyes, but she always has white skin, and it's often even whiter than the British male protagonist who falls in love with her. Right.
So they become kind of fetish objects where their racial and ethnic identity is also stripped from them so that they can kind of become good British wives in inverted commas. That's the fantasy, at least.
Very much a Snow White kind of situation there.
Yeah. So I totally agree with you with the kind of violence of the appropriation and assimilation. Definitely.
Yeah, that's it. That's the word I was looking for, actually. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that you see that, you mentioned that actually in that recurrent theme of the female mummy. She is subject to the male gaze. She's perfectly preserved throughout the millennia in a lot of these cases. Let's do the roll call, really, because this is really interesting as the basis of all mummy fiction, the mummy genre, the mummy movie genre, all kind of spills out of Conan Doyle, Lot 249 and the Jewel of Seven Stars. That's a good place to start, actually. Have you seen the Hammer version of the Blood from the Mummy's Tomb?
Yes, it's a guilty pleasure of mine.
Good. I'm glad you've seen it, because I watched that very recently, and it really struck me as how fetishized and sexualized this character was. And just for context, obviously, the film's made in 1971, but based on a book that was produced in, what was it?
1903.
1903, there we go. So this is the context of this then is contemporary discoveries at the time, I'm guessing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what is your take actually on the Jewel of Seven Stars and the blood from the mummy's tomb and that kind of thing? Like, do you think it follows the literary kind of themes quite closely in that way?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there's an obvious kind of 1970s hammer horror voluptuousness to the blood from the mummy's tomb. She's a lot more scary, I think, in the 1970s version. So we're going much more down a horror route.
Right.
And, it's an interesting one. I think the 1903 novel, she's much more of a kind of passive, objectified, definitely more of a Sleeping Beauty than a kind of revived princess. But there's a lot more kind of, I suppose, probably influenced by the context, much more of a threat of female power.
Right.
In the 70s version than there is in the 1903 version. Which I think probably has to do with 1970s feminism, probably.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, because, I mean, you have this, from a male perspective, you have this kind of anxiety running through the literature of the turn of the century with the rise of the suffrage movement and the modern woman, the first wave feminism. Do you think some of this early literature where these Egyptian princesses are kind of revived, but then they're an immediate threat who can't be obtained, is that some kind of commentary on that, or maybe a subconscious thing on the part of these writers?
Yeah, I think it definitely appears. The Jewel of Seven Stars, I think, is one of the most obviously drawing upon these narratives surrounding female emancipation. The kind of general critical consensus is that Bram Stoker was inspired by Howard Carter's discovery of the tomb of Hatshepsut, which also happened in 1903.
Right.
And so there are explicit parallels there where we get Queen Terror, who is the mummified queen, in this one, being also portrayed like Hatshepsut with male pharaonic regalia. So there is this tension there between the female pharaoh being depicted, at least in male clothing, in male kind of symbolism, and the women who at the time were kind of saying, you know what, I want to ride a bike and I want to wear a pair of trousers while I do it. There is this interesting contextual, what are women going to seize for themselves next?
Yes.
First they come for our bicycles, then they come for our trousers. Then the boat, obviously.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah, it's an interesting thing because, I mean, you see the idea of the femme fatale, and it's become a cliche for us. It's not something we necessarily examine very closely. I think it's something we take for granted as just an old trope these days. But you look back at the idea of the femme fatale and where that ideas come from and where that cultural anxiety comes from. And it comes from a very similar place to where the fear of the exotic and the orientalist, the Fu Manchu kind of tropes and stuff like that. It comes from a similar place with this anxiety of the toppling of white male cultural dominance, so to speak.
Yeah, totally.
Which is funny, really, because it ties in quite a lot, I think, with a lot of the cultural anxieties we're still dealing with today, which doesn't say much for our progress, I don't think, as a society necessarily. Coming back to the idea of this femme fatale, you also have some other examples of this with things like Rider Haggard you mentioned before, She Who Must Be Obeyed, and various mummy tales. The other one that always strikes me as an interesting one is Conan Doyle's work in this area.
Yeah.
So I'm really fuzzy on some of the earlier work. Lot 249 is that one of them, and we have there's a difference of the depiction between dried out, desiccated male mummies, who are clearly monstrous, and these kind of voluptuous sirens, so to speak, who appear perfectly preserved over the ages. Where does that first emerge, and how does it develop, that idea of the Egyptian queen, the Egyptian princess, being this kind of seductive femme fatale? How did that develop?
Well, I think in terms of what Conan Doyle and his contemporaries are explicitly drawing on, I think Shakespeare has a lot to answer for.
Okay.
But of course, Shakespeare is using earlier sources himself. So we have, the pinnacle of the Egyptian femme fatale is Cleopatra, who if you read the descriptions of her from Shakespeare, you know, she's no spring chicken. She's kind of been there, done that. She's very sexually experienced. And that's, you know, the threat is she can have any man she wants because of that. But you can go right back to the classical sources, Herodotus, and there's a particularly unsettling comment from Herodotus, which is probably entirely made up and not based in any fact whatsoever, where he talks about the dead young women whose bodies are waiting to be mummified, and how they can't give the body straight to the embalmers for fear that the embalmers will be overcome by their beauty and will defile the corpses. So they have to be left to decompose slightly before they can be mummified, which is just so Gothic. But that image, I think, of the kind of the body that is so beautiful, the woman who corrupts and brings death, as well as like the promise of kind of strange sex, it is something that's thousands of years old, and we will probably never shake, I think. Yeah.
It's interesting that you mention this kind of, and we don't tend to think about it in these terms these days, but of course, when we're objectifying the mummy and the body, there is a necrophile kind of aspect to that, which is something that I noticed was kind of unsettling when I was watching Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, and you see her father kind of, you know, uncover this perfectly preserved, with the exception of her hand, perfectly preserved female queen who is a corpse, and you know, stares at it lustfully and kind of inches in towards it, and then it cuts, and I'm thinking, well, what the hell is going on in that scene? You know, it's even worse for the fact that, of course, this ancient queen who he's discovered is the spitting image of his own daughter.
Yes.
So, you know, some really creepy, incestuous, necrophiliac kind of stuff going on in this story. And I mean, was that, for the literary genre itself, was that done knowingly? Was this some kind of commentary, or is this just an unfortunate side effect of people not really thinking through the themes they're exploring?
I think, you know, my gut instinct on this would be that they are doing it knowingly. There's lots about the ancient Egyptians that absolutely fascinates and horrifies the Victorians in equal measure. Yeah. And one of those is the kind of sister-brother marriages of, you know, pharaohs and queens. Right. Which is obviously, in ancient Egyptian terms, to kind of keep the purity of the bloodline. But in modern terms is so, to Victorians, so utterly horrifying that they're kind of fixated on it at the same time. So I think there are, the incest and the necrophiliac elements to those narratives, they come out of, I suppose, wanting to hear more, but also it being a socially unacceptable thing to discuss, which is why it kind of bubbles through in the Gothic tales.
It's a weird kind of side of this imperial narrative, isn't it? We're kind of feeding on this literature and self-perpetuating these ideas, and then the literature seems to develop in a whole bunch of different and interesting ways. So you and I met after a talk you gave on Freud and Egyptian imagery, and could we get into that a little bit, because there were some fascinating things in there that I didn't take any notes. So that's my confession for that. I didn't have a notepad with me. I was just sitting and trying to kind of absorb the information. But it seems that Freud had a lot of interesting thoughts on what the Egyptian symbolism being deciphered at the time was about. Could you take us through that a little bit? Yeah,
of course. Freud is a peculiar one. He's got such a passion for Egyptology. So he has all of these objects facing him on his desk, not just from Egypt, but from Greece and Rome and various other ancient cultures. But Egypt seems to be his favourite. And he's interested in particularly maternal symbolism. He's interested in lots of the sexual symbolism. And I think once Freud starts kind of publishing some of his thoughts, and this, I suppose, historically we would see an interesting shift in both literature and how explicit the literature is in dealing with these, what we would probably call Freudian themes.
Yes.
And also in terms of what Egyptologists feel comfortable talking about and what they want to publish on as well. So the famous one that I mentioned at that Freud talk was the maternal nightmare of the bird people who take his mother away. This, especially, the image of the kite, which is a mistranslation, isn't it? I remember you talking to me about this, that it's the Egyptian hieroglyph that he's talking about. Is it a kite? Is it a vulture? What's he kind of getting confused with there? But it's this image, I suppose, of creatures that are part human, part animal, and what's the kind of sexual threat of these hybrid bodies that emerge in nightmares.
Right. And this is in Freud's own nightmares, because you say he has a recurring nightmare about these bird people coming and stealing his mother away.
Yeah.
And the confusion for the hieroglyph, by the way, just for the listeners who don't have a reference point for that. So there's the hieroglyph. Is it he interprets it as a kite?
It's the mut vulture, isn't it?
Yes, it's the mut vulture, which of course does stand in for mother.
Yes, he's also talking about Leonardo da Vinci to further complicate matters.
Right, okay. So how does da Vinci factor into this?
So da Vinci has a dream where he is being struck on the mouth as a baby with a kite's tail.
Right.
But it's not a kite, it's a mistranslation. So there's a mistranslation that Freud is interpreting as well to further complicate matters. And he connects Leonardo's dream of the kite's tail being kind of hit against his mouth, I suppose, as similar to his bird-headed, potentially Egyptian gods, if we want to interpret it that way, seizing his mother.
So what was Da Vinci's misinterpretation? What did they clarify it to be?
Well, I think the word is it supposed to be vulture, and Freud interprets it as a kite. There is definitely mistranslation going on.
So it's a misinterpretation of a mistranslation, but it still ties together, which is really interesting, because if it's a vulture, then that does tie into concepts of Egyptian motherhood as well. And the kite itself was one of the birds that, and we spoke about this, didn't we, was one of the birds that Isis was said to have taken the form of when both searching for Osiris and copulating with Osiris post-mortem to conceive the baby Horus, who is, of course, the hawk-headed deity. So there's a lot of bird-headed theme going on here, to be fair. And it struck me as interesting how that all tied together, even though there'd been misinterpretation. The other thing that strikes me from that, of course, is that Da Vinci's having a nightmare. Is it described as a nightmare rather than a dream?
I think it's a dream for Da Vinci. It's definitely a nightmare for Freud.
Okay, got you. So Da Vinci's having a dream that his mouth is being struck, which reminds me of how, and this might be reaching, but the symbolism is the same, how we observe the mouth of the mummy is hit with the adze, which is like a small tool. So as part of the embalming process and the mummification process, the mouth is struck with this tool, or cut symbolically with this tool, to open the mouth. It's called the opening of the mouth ritual, opening of the mouth ceremony. And it's to give the deceased the voice so that they can speak the spells from the Book of the Dead and gain safe passage through the underworld.
That's incredible.
So there's a really interesting set of symbols in there that really do go full circle if you want to apply that, to it. But of course, we do always have to be careful of how much we're projecting onto these things. And I remember you mentioning there were ties to a couple of figures I found particularly fascinating. So the first was Aleister Crowley. Could you take us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Aleister Crowley was, I suppose, in terms of his Egyptological interests, he's got, if you read some of his poetry, he's interested in Egyptian sexuality, I suppose. And there's a particular poem which is about two ancient Egyptian men who some have interpreted to be brothers and some have interpreted to be lovers. And Crowley is very much interested in interpreting them as lovers. He's interested in mythological stories that connect Horus and Set and deal with Horus's sexual assault at the hands of Set, I suppose. So that's what's particularly fascinating to him. He performs magical rituals inside the Great Pyramid, supposedly, but he's got some interesting connections in that he is He's working with Battiscombe Gunn at some point.
This was the translation of the Stele 666, is that right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your flow.
No. I think I only know a little bit about this, and there's probably far more to be unearthed. But he's working with Battiscombe Gunn, and so we have Egyptologists who are themselves working on the peripheries of occultism in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
And certainly going back into the 19th century, which is something that most Egyptologists, if they're involved in nowadays, don't really want to admit it. Absolutely,
yeah, and it was one of the things that was really important to me when I was looking at alternative approaches to Egypt in the modern era, is these kind of boundaries that have developed in the discipline over the last century or so. And when you start really antagonizing those things, you realize, oh, but this has never really been the case. This has always been a permeable boundary, so to speak. There have always been Egyptologists interested in the occult. There have always been crossovers from the esoteric and the occult into Egyptology. And the more you interrogate the origins of the field, the more that we see, exactly like you say, people like Gunn working with Crowley on the Stele 666 was... it was a stele that Crowley discovered at I think it was the Bulaq Museum in Cairo. So not the museum, the main Egyptian museum. And he purports in the Book of the Law, which of course is what he called the holy book for the Church of Thelema, his Egyptian-themed religious movement. He claims to have had these visions when he's in Cairo in, I think it's about 1904. Which is interesting because it ties into when a lot of this literature is being produced. And he goes to the museum, finds this stele, says this is a stele, and it's a stele of a god called Ra-Harakti, Horus of the Horizon. It's like a war form of Horus. And then he spends 3 days, presumably off his nut on drugs, in Cairo, dictating a book which he claims is being dictated to him from an entity in the corner of the room called Awas.
Yes.
And then we have this movement. So yeah, that's my little interjection there. But the key thing being there that Egyptologists came in to help him translate this stele from which he's created this, this religious movement that Egyptologists now would absolutely, wash their hands of. So yeah, coming back to Crowley. So interesting, he's creating literature like that as well, because he knew Florence Farr from the Golden Dawn, correct?
Yes, yeah.
Florence Farr, first wave feminist, known for writing a couple of plays. What was it? The Shrine of the Golden Hawk and...
Yes. I can't remember the title of the other one at the moment.
No, it was Egyptian themed as well, though, wasn't it?
Yes.
So is it possible that through Florence Farr, who was amateur Egyptologist, wrote a book on Egyptian magic, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, that's correct.
And both members of the Golden Dawns, what could her influence on him and on his interest in Egyptology possibly could have been?
Florence Farr had her own little sphere group, it was called. It was a kind of club within the Golden Dawn with all of the members who were particularly interested in Egyptian things. And the people in charge of the Golden Dawn weren't very pleased with her for doing this. So eventually, I think that's why a lot of Golden Dawn members left. I'm not sure if Crowley was around, but he possibly might have been involved with the sphere group. But certainly her interests were very much Egyptian focused, whereas others in the Golden Dawn were much more kind of Celtic influenced. People like Yeats especially, but I think with Yeats you see a little bit of the crossover between the Celtic and the Egyptian that you kind of see earlier with Wordsworth, with that poem you mentioned with Merlin and the Egyptian princess. But Farr was supposedly in contact with ancient Egyptian spirits. She was going to the British Museum and communicating with them, in theory, through artefacts which were connected to those people, often their mummy boards and mummy cases. What's interesting about Farr is that she really gets E.A. Wallis Budge on her side.
Right.
So, once again, we have somebody who is predominantly an occultist, who is on the edges of scholarly Egyptology, possibly because she's an attractive young woman, although I don't want to speculate too much. Budge quite likes spending time with her, working with her, showing her artifacts. And the same with Edith Nesbit, actually, who wrote 5 Children in It. So you do get people with literary interests kind of hobnobbing with Budge, especially. H. Rider Haggard's one of his good friends too. So although Crowley is a bit more of the bad boy as opposed to Florence Farr, who's much more into the kind of white magic side of things as opposed to the kind of drug taking and orgies in the desert.
Right.
You know, a lot more of the Egyptologists, I think, get on board with that kind of softer occultism that's not doing the nasty stuff.
Right, because there's kind of the sense of the spiritualist movement as well being quite gaining traction during that period. And wasn't Conan Doyle actually a member of the Spiritualist Society as well?
Yes, he was. He was big into that.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I find this really interesting because if you, just coming off topic for a second, just to look at someone like Doyle, you've got this idea that he created this very rationalist, scientifically minded, logic-driven Sherlock Holmes, who, when you really look at his world, it's just as magical in so many ways. You know, his process is just as magical. It's just as mystical. It's just as... and coming back to Farr and Budge, I mean, Farr was part of they call it the Bloomsbury set, don't they? With a group of writers and playwrights and actors and thespians of the period, all of whom are, well, hobnobbing, really, socialites as well, aren't they? So they're really well known in this scene. And then you've got Budge, and it's funny because we don't think about Budge in this way these days. I see Budge kind of candidly spoken about as just kind of a dry old Egyptologist, but really he was the person that everyone wanted at their dinner party. He was the toast of the town a lot of the time because of this fascination with Egypt, wasn't he? So it's really interesting to see that we've got this almost false boundary has been created through a rewriting of history almost, or an ignorance of history, to delineate a very different world to these people when they were really very much sharing the same circles.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way to put it, actually. And you know, you look at who's friends with who, and you realise, okay, that this is a shared social world. You know, if H. Rider Haggard needs a translation, he just goes to the British Museum and pops in to see Budge, and he has it in a second. And
yes,
it's not an exclusive world, which I think often people think of Egyptology as, you know, the ivory tower and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I guess it's become slightly more separate from other fields as time has gone on and things become more specialised. And I mean, Egyptology itself is criticised as being far too separate from archaeology in general and the archaeology of the Near East. So I suppose it has become more insular over time. It's really interesting to think about its origins being less so.
Very populist, but I don't know. I think being an outsider and going into Egyptological archives and going into museums, I have found Egyptologists almost universally to be very welcoming and very engaged with the public as well.
No, well, that's very true. Yeah, I mean, yeah, things like this podcast, hopefully.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's what we're all about. But of course, you know, it's one of those subjects where it's public driven a lot of the time, and a lot of the excavations are publicly driven or funded, and so it has to be a symbiotic relationship, despite the fact that it's absolutely right to say that there is an ivory tower, because there's a self-conception of it being separate somehow from other disciplines. But that seems to be changing, hopefully.
Yeah.
It seems, you know, it's not quite what it was. And coming back to the literature and coming back to the Gothic literature, you know, what is it about Egypt specifically, you know, that characterises or is perpetuated or that blends well with Gothic literature? What are the themes that they're really getting into?
Well, I mean, there's the obvious kind of human remains focus, which, you know, we get in so many the kind of big names in Gothic. We already have Bram Stoker writing Dracula before he does his mummy story. You know, most of the monsters that stick with us, Frankenstein's creature, for instance, cobbled together out of dead human parts. The mummy, which is a former dead human, the vampire that comes back from the dead human. it seems to be a fixation with what happens to us after we die, to be honest, which, let's face it, is one of the biggest questions that we may probably never solve. But there are other themes, I think in terms of, for Western audiences, certainly Egypt in the Bible, where, you know, the rivers are running with blood, plagues, eclipses. It all seems very kind of melodramatic, Gothic.
Yes.
And so this, the tombs, the oppressive weight of the pyramids, for a long time, by Westerners at least, unreadable hieroglyphs. It carries this kind of weight of mystery. And despite Egypt being very sunny and bright, there's a gloom to it as well that people are fascinated by. Yeah.
And that's kind of perpetuated in a lot of the artwork of the period as well. And how does... this was something I was curious about, because you made mention of H.P. Lovecraft.
Oh, yes.
Famous horror writer. You made mention of him in your talk, and that's something I was curious about, actually, because being someone who grew up not so much reading much Lovecraft, but like engaging in the culture that Lovecraft had spawned, you know, like games and films and, you know, pop culture kind of offspring of Lovecraft. But coming back to the literature itself, where does that tie in to this kind of Gothic and Egyptian inspired literature?
Well, the main story that people go to when they look for Egyptian connections in Lovecraft is Under the Pyramids, which
of course
supposedly Harry Houdini wrote, but it was really Lovecraft, wasn't it?
Right.
This tale of Houdini being tricked by some men who he hires to show him around a pyramid, and they tie him up and he has to do his amazing escapology. But then once he's free of these ties, he's kind of left under the ground, and he hears strange sounds coming from beneath him. And once he goes down there to investigate, obviously it's the typical Lovecraft thing of these old gods waiting down there underneath the earth. But, you know, I think Lovecraft more broadly, he's probably more interested in the classics than he is in Egyptology. But you do get these traces of Egypt in a couple of the gods which have Egyptian-sounding names or Egyptian-sounding forms. And in his fixation as well on the unreadable script, these kind of mysterious alphabets that nobody can decipher, pictograms, that kind of thing. And archaeology as well. He's fascinated by what could archaeology dredge up that should best be left where it was.
Right. Yeah, I guess that's an interesting theme that's picked up, the idea of the violation perpetuated by archaeology.
Yeah, well. Absolutely.
What things might we wake up? And I guess that's quite a common theme now in horror movies in general, actually. It doesn't necessarily need to be archaeology based now. It's someone performs some kind of sin and then everyone dies.
Yes. Yeah. Never read aloud from a creepy book.
Right, exactly. Yes, of course. You must never read from the book. Yeah, which brings us back to The Mummy, which, I mean, I'm a huge fan of that film. I rewatched it recently, and I must admit there was a period around the turn of the millennium. It seemed like everywhere you looked, there was Egypt, because we had The Mummy, we had films like Stargate, we had various video games popping up. The Tomb Raider series went back to Egypt exclusively that year. I remember playing that with absolute glee. All kinds of things popping up in the literature. And then, of course, there was the Egyptomania of the period as well. So you had the quote-unquote alternative archaeologists sticking their oar in with books like, the pyramid codes and, secrets of Sphinx and redating this, that, and the other. And I can't think of the titles off the top of my head, but there were a lot of them. Fingerprints of the Gods and things like that. And this expectation that something would be found.
Yeah.
Some new discovery would be made. It was Edgar Cayce, wasn't it, the psychic, that predicted there would be a Hall of Records would be discovered at the turn of the millennium. Alas. Well, the conspiracy theorists would have you believe it. Otherwise.
That's true.
But we've got some really interesting, I guess, intersections between ancient Egypt and the esoteric and spiritualism and what do you think the influence of that, lasting influence of that, has been on culture and literature?
I mean, I think your point about alternative archaeologies and this very popular desire, if you look at the viewing figures for lots of these documentaries, for instance, well, I suppose it goes hand in hand with a kind of mistrust of experts, or not wanting to believe what experts say, but also kind of a renewed desire to believe in something otherworldly or enchanted, or more than what there was, to be honest. And I think that is a very tangible legacy of the 19th century, because in all these stories of things being awoken, of the longevity of ancient Egyptian magic and of curses, and what ancient Egyptian presences can still do in terms of impacting our modern world, I think that has really not exactly snowballed, but kind of come in peaks and troughs since that point. The ancient alien stuff you can trace back to late 19th century science fiction, where people go to Mars and they see a Sphinx on Mars, and this is all the stuff that gets repeated nowadays. It's over 100 years old.
Yeah, and actually, kind of pulling a thread out there, the idea of the curse that has its origins in the literature of the turn of the century. So the curse represents something else, doesn't it? It represents that anxiety again. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Of the imperialist exercise. And well, what is it really? I suppose it's the idea of violation from the west to the east, and it being somehow a dangerous, weird, exotic thing. Or what do you make of it?
There are letters to Howard Carter once Carnarvon has died during the Tutankhamun excavations that say you need somebody, a spiritualist who can get in touch with the Ka to placate this spirit, and ideally this would be a native Egyptian. So I think it's very much bound up in ideas of nationality and who ancient Egypt belongs to, and what might be the repercussions if the British and other Europeans and the Americans go in and try to siphon some of that off for themselves. But I was really fascinated to see the other day, talking about the most recent Tutankhamun exhibition at the British Museum at the moment, a headline about the cursed trumpets and how the cursed trumpets have arrived in London. And I thought, cursed was in quotation marks, so there was a bit of tongue-in-cheek stuff going on, but the curse is still what the media cling on to this day.
It really is, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and there's a whole lot of literature just about the literature that surrounded the Curse of Tutankhamun as well, isn't there now? There's various books dealing with that. Curse of the Mummy. A couple of books called The Curse of the Mummy, in fact, aren't there? Jasmine Day and, was it Luckhurst? Yeah,
Roger Luckhurst.
Yeah, really fascinating stuff.
And there's your book as well, don't forget your book.
Oh, well, yeah, I'm not really dealing with curses, though. So, coming back to these stories, do you have a favourite?
Ooh, that's a really good question. My favourite one, I think, probably is the story of Howard Carter's canary, because it's supposedly a true story. But I think it's my favourite because there's a happy ending. I'm an animal lover and I don't want anything bad to happen to Carter's canary.
Amen to that, yeah. Could you just tell us that story, just to clarify for the audience?
Of course. So, supposedly, according to Howard Carter, he arrives in Egypt, he's excavating, and he is just wandering around one day through a marketplace, and he hears this canary singing, and he thinks, oh, I need to get that canary. It needs to be my companion. I need to hear its beautiful singing as I work. So he purchases the canary, and he takes it to the dig site, and it starts to sing all the more joyfully, and the steps are discovered going down to the tomb. And at this kind of pertinent moment in the tale, the canary, which used to be so happy and uplifting, stops singing. And the local men that Howard Carter is employing on the dig, as in all of these stories, start to kind of whisper about how something bad's going to happen, and the canary knows something's up. Anyway, on the day in which that first penetration into the tomb is made, and Howard Carter looks through and sees the artifacts within, he describes in his account of the story how he first sets eyes on those black and gold guardian figures, and specifically his eyes fall on the Uraeus, so the cobra. And he learns that at that moment, unfortunately, back in his lodgings a cobra has killed his canary. So the story is supposedly that some kind of spirit related to Tutankhamun has entered into this cobra and killed Carter's canary in retaliation. I was really interested in this because Howard Carter usually doesn't, in his writings, doesn't like to encourage the curse story. He finds it all a bit annoying. As you can probably imagine, it would get annoying.
Yeah.
Especially after your patrons died and you want people to kind of, not peddle this story over and over again and say it's the curse. But what's really interesting is if you look at Carter's diaries, firstly, not only does the bird arrive much later than the discovery of the steps in his diary, so he's added that bit in for the sake of telling a good yarn. Okay. But also later in his diaries, there is another reference to a canary. So in my opinion, I like to think that Carter's canary never died and that it was just a good story that he told for the sake of, a chill down the spine of people who visited the tomb. The other interpretation is he just bought a second canary. So.
Right. I suppose that's possible. Yeah.
That's my favourite one. I think that's interesting in terms of not just a fun story, but also what the Egyptologists themselves are kind of spinning in terms of stories they can tell their mates after the dig.
Yeah, because it's interesting, isn't it? Because as you rightly say, he's not known as being one of the kind of main peddlers of the curse idea at all, and it's much more than newspapers of the time. Is that right? Definitely.
I mean, the Times has sole rights to the actual information about the dig that Carnarvon and Carter are kind of feeding them, right. And so the other newspapers, in a bid to kind of get in on some of the action and sell some copies, are basically just kind of gossip mongering at that point.
Right.
And the curse sells, as it still does today.
It still does. It absolutely does. Yeah. And it's interesting to see that being kind of not so much perpetuated, but referenced at least in the wake of the new touring of the King Tut's treasures.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
There are so many stories that surround that hoard as well, aren't there? I mean, not least the death of Carnarvon, but you also have the tale of is it Carnarvon's dog?
Yes.
Keening out at the moment of his death. Carnarvon is still in Egypt, is that right? When he dies?
That's correct. And the dog dies in Britain.
At the same time. And this story is still maintained by the family, isn't it?
I think so. I'm not sure how they figured the time difference.
Yes, of course. Yeah. It was exactly midnight, plus or minus 1 hour. Yeah. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, absolutely. And the lights flickering in Cairo as it happened, which, according to contemporary accounts, just tended to happen quite a lot anyway.
I can imagine, yeah, that was not an uncommon occurrence with the grid being as it was at the time. Yeah. But yes, it does all kind of blend together to make a nice narrative, I suppose. And it certainly sells newspapers. And moving on slightly, you've taken a bit of a foray into the world of literature yourself, haven't you? So you've collected and edited a volume, Silver Bullets, of classic werewolf stories. What attracted you to those?
Oh, probably similar reasons to the Egyptological stories. Lots of them, and this is the same as mummy fiction as well, lots of these stories are written by women, which I think comes as a surprise to people initially. Some of these women were, politically very motivated, so that we have people like Clemence Houseman, who was a suffragette, writing one of the best-known werewolf stories of the late 19th, early 20th centuries.
Which story is that?
That's called The Werewolf.
Oh, okay. All right.
Very unoriginally.
On the nose, but yeah, okay.
Yes, but it's about a female werewolf, which is kind of different. And similarly, if you look to the early mummy stories, a lot of them are people you wouldn't expect. So we get Louisa May Alcott, author of Little Women, and she writes this mummy story at the same time that she writes Little Women. So we get people you don't necessarily assume are writing in the kind of Gothic, lurid vibe, actually participating in that and doing it as well as the guys.
Yeah, absolutely, I'm sure. What was her story, Alcott's mummy story?
So hers is about it's very similar in that it's about breaking into a pyramid. I think it's a pyramid, and these two male explorers who are in this pyramid, they burn a female mummy in order to produce light, in order to see inside the darkness. And the female mummy gets her vengeance. I think there's a kind of subgenre of mummy stories where there are kind of mysterious plants, and it's riffing off the mummy wheat rumours, the mummy peas and mummy wheat.
What are those?
Oh, it's a very strange little thing that you get in the 19th century predominantly, or you do get it in the 20th century as well, where people claim to have found wheat or peas or any other kind of seed in tombs or buried with mummies, which when you plant them actually grow. And it's all entirely false, that you can't grow things that are that old. But
Right.
the story goes that you can grow flowers, wheat, and you can eat the same wheat that the Egyptians ate, that kind of thing. In this story, it's a poisonous flower. And usually, if it's a poisonous flower, it's the flower is given to or taken by a woman who is in some way associated with the excavators, and it's too late by the time that they realise that the plant is going to kill her. So it's a kind of sinister living on of ancient Egypt in some way that isn't the revived mummy, but it's something still alive that's come from something supposedly dead.
And something getting its revenge.
Absolutely.
Yeah, post-mortem. That's fascinating stuff. Yeah, because is that Lost in the Pyramid? That story?
Yes, that's it.
Lost in the Pyramid, yeah. I do remember reading about it a long time ago. There are so many stories of that era. Well, I just find that the longer it is between reads, the more they all blend together for me. So.
There are very much recycled tropes.
Would you recommend any as modern reads in particular?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, one of my favourites is a very unliterary thriller called Ziska by Mary Corelli. It's about, and I won't give too much away, it's about a man who falls in love with this beautiful and mysterious Russian princess. Mm-hmm. But perhaps she is not a Russian princess after all, and maybe there is a kind of vengeance plot going on there as well.
Brilliant. Ziska,
yeah. You'll power through it. It's not very good literature.
Okay.
But it certainly captures the attention. She was pretty much the best-selling author of the 19th century, but her name is little known today.
Right.
Aside from Victorian literature scholars.
Well, as ever, I shall do some digging and make sure that there are links included in the show notes. Wow. Well, this has been a really fascinating journey through some 19th century literature and culture and themes. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really enjoyed it.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
As a final thing, you have a new volume coming out dealing with Egyptomania, is that right?
That's right, yep.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
It is coming out with Bloomsbury in January.
And it's called?
Is it Egypt and the Modern Imagination, Art, Literature and Culture? I think that's it.
Yeah. Yep.
It has a beautifully designed cover. The cover designer did a fabulous
gorgeous.
job.
Yeah.
It's lovely, and the chapters are, a lot of them come from the early Tea with the Sphinx contributions as well. So that's tying a nice little knot in the end of that project for me, I think.
Which brings us absolutely full circle as well, back to Tea with the Sphinx. I'm looking forward to reading it. I'm going to bug you to do some kind of book swap at some point, I'm sure. No, absolutely fascinating stuff. Ancient Egypt in the modern imagination, art, literature, and culture. I love Egyptomania. That's part of the reason I still do this, despite not, officially working as an Egyptologist lecturer right now. And it's always great to keep my hand in. So that sounds absolutely fascinating. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. And I hope we can have many more conversations like this in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
That's sadly all we have time for today, but be sure to check back in for new episodes which continue to explore manifestations of the ancient world in the modern, including interviews with a bevy of archaeologists and Egyptologists, cometics and reconstructionists, and key players in historical entertainment, including authors, filmmakers, actors, and game designers. If you like the show, please subscribe and rate it on your preferred platform, and tell all your friends. I've been Dr. Harrison, and this was the Profane Egyptologist podcast. Thanks for listening.